Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to climate journalist Emily Atkin on Two Broads Talking Politics, per the Demcast Podcast Network. Bye!
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts, and I am on today with climate journalist Emily Atkin, who writes Heated, a newsletter for people who are pissed off about the climate crisis, like me. So hi Emily, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So as background, maybe you could just talk a little bit about your career to this point and how you started writing this newsletter.
Sure. Well, I first started in climate journalism in 2013. I worked at Think Progress. That was back when we didn't really have that many climate reporters. We had environmental reporters, but it was really rare to see like a climate reporter job listing. And I worked there for a few years. I did a little stint at Sinclair Broadcast Group, covering politics and a little bit of climate policy. Worked at the New Republic for a while, covering climate change and the environment. And about 4 months ago, I left to start this newsletter, which I did because I really just wanted to focus on the stuff that made me the most angry and rageful about climate change, which was the sort of the fact that powerful people who we've given the responsibility to solve our biggest problems keep failing us in so many different ways. You know, politicians, media, even activists, people with the power, real power to change what we're doing and solve this awful crisis that we've known about for so long, just keep not doing it. And so I wanted to do that every day. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 4 months.
So about a year ago, just about a year ago on this podcast, we did a series of 6 episodes trying to talk about the climate crisis in a bunch of different ways and policy and things that could change. And it got very little traction. It seemed like just nobody was paying any attention, and I get there's a lot else going on in politics and in the news. But do you think it feels to me like there's been a shift of some sort, even over the past year, that people are starting to get it and care about it? Is that your sense? It seems like you've gotten a lot of good reactions to the launch of your newsletter.
Yeah, absolutely. I've talked about this a lot over the last year, how it's really felt like there's been a sea change in the last little over a year, ever since the midterm elections in 2018. Actually, I would personally trace it to when Ocasio-Cortez got elected and she started talking about the Green New Deal. And then at that same moment, the Sunrise Movement, this grassroots youth-led climate activist group, started doing these protests on Capitol Hill outside Nancy Pelosi's office. And they started, I think the common theme is that they were driven by this sense of outrage and anger about the climate crisis that was at that point, it existed, but was lacking in a really mainstream way. I think that's one reason why Greta Thunberg is so effective, is that she's really pissed off about why she has to be leaving her home as a child to get adults to just do something because they keep refusing to. And I think that's really woken people up how much of an injustice this is. And I think probably also paired with the fact that it's really, climate change is becoming more and more visible to us every year. I think when I started in 2013, it was so much easier to deny that climate change was happening because it wasn't as clearly apparent. And year over year, every single year was the hottest year, and every single year is seeing destructive weather events like the ones we're seeing in Australia. And now, it's just, I think that's helped too, but certainly, yeah, it's a good time to be someone who's talking about climate change because people are starting to pay attention.
So I've spent the past, 20 plus years thinking if I could just recycle more and compost more and, reduce my own carbon footprint, like that'll help. That'll solve everything. And it seems like we've finally reached the point where it's clear that no, that's not going to do it. So talk to me some about what in your sort of final newsletter of 2019, you were talking about these big corporations that really knew climate change was coming and just actively worked to suppress information about it. And so what do we know about that and that piece of it? And then how do we finally get to a point where we can hold corporations accountable, not just for what they've done in the past, but what we need them to be doing to be changing in the future?
Oh my God, that question is like my whole career. That question is like, I mean, like, how do we know that companies, big oil companies and coal companies knew they were contributing to climate change, and how far back did they know? What did they know? When did they know it? There's so much documentation of polluters knowing that their carbon dioxide emissions dating back to the mid-60s were going to cause a warming of the planet that would fundamentally alter the climate in a harmful way. And then by their actions after that, we know that instead of changing their business model to ensure that awful effect didn't happen, they instead chose to engage in climate science denial campaigns, so efforts to suppress the information that they knew so that we wouldn't pass any policy that would harm their business model. Big oil companies, coal companies, freight rail companies, these are all freight rail is important because freight rail transports most of our coal, so they're very invested in fossil fuels, decided to spend their money forming think tanks to produce studies or to produce policy papers that showed that maybe the climate science thing was a hoax, or started funding politicians who wouldn't push climate policy. There's a paper that just came out a couple weeks ago by Robert Brule, who's an environmental sociologist, showing how much money fossil fuel companies have spent on advertising every single year. It averages about $300 million a year that each company spends on advertising, trying to convince us that they're doing the right thing on reducing emissions. Meanwhile, they're invested in extracting more fossil fuel than the planet can burn if we're going to maintain a safe climate, because fossil fuel companies have their investments planned out for years in advance. So, I mean, it's a huge question. You also asked how we're going to hold them accountable. I mean, there are tons of lawsuits to hold them accountable, to try and get them to pay for the damage that they caused by suppressing climate science information and actively spreading misinformation, promoting misinformation. I mean, if you think about why we haven't done anything on climate change, it's because half of our political system has insisted that nothing was going on. And why did they insist that nothing was going on? It's because they're bought and paid for by fossil fuel companies. So it seems like it can't be that simple, but it super is.
So obviously we need large structural change. The individual actions of me or you aren't gonna make a dent in this. Do you think it's still worthwhile for people to be thinking about individual actions? And I've been trying to work to reduce my carbon output, and I think I'm pretty good at it. But does that? I know it doesn't matter in the larger scale. Do you think it matters in sort of a micro scale? Is it still something we should be thinking about and doing?
I mean, I don't think it's bad to think about what you can do to reduce your personal carbon footprint. But at the same time, I think it's really important for everyone to know that that's exactly what fossil fuel companies want you to be focused on, not on changing their behavior, not on getting them to extract and burn less fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy. They've literally funded campaigns, advertising campaigns to be like, this is how you reduce your carbon footprint. Use less energy by turning off your lights. And that's the same tactic that plastic producing companies have used over the years. They invest in advertising consumer recycling campaigns so that they don't have to stop producing less plastic. But we know that most of the emissions from plastic, because plastic is made out of petrochemicals, aka oil, that it comes from the production of the plastic. Once you already have that piece of plastic in your hand, most of the damage has been done. At the same time, once you're already eating that meat, or once you're already looking at the store, you're at the store and making that decision on what to buy, most of the damage has already been done. We as individuals are at the end of the life cycle phase of all carbon emissions. What we have to stop is the carbon emissions at the source. And so while I would never crap on somebody for doing everything they can to reduce their personal carbon footprint, what I would crap on is people thinking that's the most important thing, because it just isn't.
So I want to talk some about what is going on in Australia, and I'm very much afraid we're recording this on January 3rd. And so just last night, Trump apparently unilaterally declared war on Iran. And, it seemed like the Australia news was finally sort of breaking through and people were paying attention. And I think that people are going to be really distracted now, and I don't want to let go of this story. So can you put some of this in context? What is happening in Australia, and how does that compare to other climate crises that we've been seeing over the past few years?
So Australia is on fire. I think a lot of people know that. I think a lot of people know that the wildfires in Australia right now are really bad, but it's a good question to ask to put it in context. I actually saw something earlier today that helped me put it in context. First of all, Australia always has wildfires. They're called bushfires, but they're way earlier this year than they're not supposed to be this bad this early. And they're so out of control that fire crews are literally just don't know what to do. And something that I read that put it in context for me was, we were all freaking out about the fires in the Amazon this year, or last year, I guess, because it's now 2020. So that the Amazon fires in 2019 burned 900,000 hectares. Is that how you pronounce it? Listen, I do most of my talking on the internet, so I don't know how to pronounce someone. So but the 2019 fires in the Amazon burned 900,000 hectares. Let's just say that's how we pronounce it. 900,000. 2018 in California, that was a really bad year, burned 1.8 million hectares. And since July in New South Wales, 3 million hectares have burned. And that was December 30th when that happened. There's so much more area of land has burned in Australia than in these other crises that we really freaked out about. I read another article that said that the tops of mountains in Australia are turning brown. Like the tops of ice-capped mountains are turning brown, and that air quality in New Zealand is being affected by these wildfires. That there are photos of people just standing on the beach because that's the only place that they can go where nothing is burning. It's the worst fire season in decades. And they sort of like us. I think Australia is one of the best comparisons to the United States in terms of climate denial and governments that refuse to do anything about climate change, refuse to prepare for climate change, refuse to mitigate climate change, refuse to listen to the warnings of scientists and experts. And this is what happens. We often talk about how the United States is the only country in the world that denies climate change. It's not true. Australia is one of the worst culprits of climate denial as well. It's a lesson because now they're ground zero for the climate catastrophe. Not only is it burning over there, I mean, the Great Barrier Reef is dying. Its kelp forests have vanished. Like a bunch of towns have run out of water. It's literally, the continent has never burned like this before. And that's not my opinion. That you can find that anywhere.
So I guess one question I have is in messaging and figuring out how we reach people with all of this. You know, I feel like, you know, you've been at this for a while and sort of must sometimes feel like you're just shouting into the void and no one's hearing it. You know, I haven't been shouting as loudly perhaps, but, you know, a lot of us have been trying to call an alarm for a while. You know, I'm old enough to remember that this was global warming for a long time before we started calling it climate change. We've been talking about climate change, climate denial. Do you think that these are words that are reaching people? Is this a messaging problem? Is it a problem of getting the right information to the right people? You know, other than changing who is in power, are there things we can do to make sure that people really understand the extent of the problem?
I mean, this is my personal opinion after just being on this beat for 6 years and sort of taking into consideration my own personal journey on what kind of journalism is effective, watching what has really been effective over the last year and a half, this sea change of public opinion about climate change. And I think it really is just about showing people how leadership is failing and being really honestly pissed off about it, because for a long time, most journalists, politicians, activists approach climate change as this kind of like dry subject, where it was seen as being actually alarmist. That's a word that like conservatives use to describe people who are just saying the science, like terrifying science about climate change. I think that for so long, we haven't been talking about climate change as if it's a crisis. We only recently just started using the term climate crisis, but even some like news outlets that use that phrase still are writing about it in this really dry tone that doesn't convey the actual urgency, injustice, and threat that climate change conveys. I think it just is going to take more courage from powerful people to call out what the real problem is, which is just people being, just people in power shirking their responsibilities, and how awful that is, and how people are dooming us. Companies are literally dooming the future generations, ecosystems, animals, the economy. That's the stakes are so high, and we've just been talking about it like it's this boring ass science story for a long time. And I really think it's as simple as just being honest about the stakes. Because we're seeing, I mean, think about how much change you've felt and seen over the last year and a half without even being able to quantify it.
Yeah, we've got this 2020 election coming up very quickly, and there's a lot of sort of back and forth between people about are we trying to elect a progressive candidate? Are we trying to elect an exciting candidate? Are we trying to, you know, just find someone who's electable? You know, and I've seen sort of push back and forth on people saying the only important thing is defeating Donald Trump, and other people saying, you know, if we don't pick the right Democrat, whatever that might mean, you know, it's not going to do enough to address the climate crisis. You know, I'm not going to ask you to tell us who to vote for, but, you know, do you think it seems clear that Trump is not alone the problem? But do you think that any Democrat will address this problem better? Do you think this should be a top of mind issue for people to be thinking about when they're voting? You know, how would you sort of address that kind of tension in the race?
Well, it absolutely has to be a priority I think it has to be a priority of voters, really. When we're talking about what people have to do, how to change it, it honestly has to be people's priority, climate change, because it does as climate change worsens, so will every other issue that you care about. So the healthcare system will get more expensive. The immigration system will get more clogged, and awful conflict, war will worsen. Environmental degradation in general will worsen. Racial injustice will worsen because climate change affects low-income African American, Hispanic, non-white areas more severely than white areas. I mean, literally any issue that you care about as a progressive gets worse if climate change is allowed to worsen. And so we have a field of candidates who are addressing climate change literally like never before on the Democratic side. I covered the 2016 election on the campaign trail, and the most you ever heard anybody talk about climate change was saying it's real and it's important. Now you have every single Democratic candidate has a pretty widespread, sweeping climate plan that is fairly in line with the scientific goals, the science that says how much we have to reduce carbon by when if we're going to maintain a livable, safe planet, right? So that's awesome. Every candidate, every Democratic candidate, every major one has something like that. Now, I don't endorse candidates at all, but I will say that I think that 3 Democratic candidates, probably have the strongest plans when it comes to holding fossil fuel companies accountable for their role in worsening the climate crisis. I say this a lot in my newsletter about how, if fossil fuel companies hadn't engaged in coordinated disinformation campaigns, we certainly would have started passing climate legislation far earlier than we have. I mean, we never have. Congress has never passed any meaningful climate legislation. And the first meaningful climate regulation that we had was under Obama, and Trump repealed it. And the evidence of that is that we had bipartisan climate legislation in the works in 1989, in 1990, until the fossil fuel industry mobilized to dismantle it and start funding climate denial. So the 3 candidates who seek financial accountability from fossil fuel companies, that is to get them to pay for some of the damage that climate change is going to wreak, are Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Cory Booker, weirdly enough, because people don't really talk about Cory Booker. And Bernie Sanders is actually the only candidate that talks about criminal liability for fossil fuel companies. He thinks that, fossil fuel executives who chose to lie about climate science and doom the future of the planet for profit should be put in jail. That's a controversial position, but that's Bernie Sanders' position. He says it all the time. Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker talk a lot about civil accountability. So just seeking financial damages. And there are a ton of lawsuits going on right now from states and towns seeking the same thing.
Are there other topics or things that you would like to make sure that we talk about today?
Climate change is bad. We should talk more about climate change. It's interesting. I think that a lot of people in the media in particular don't think it's interesting, but I think a lot of people care. I don't really have any specifics other than that. It's everything, it's everything we love and care about. It affects. And I honestly think it's one of the most interesting stories to tell just from a storytelling perspective. Like a lot of journalists I've heard, want to shy away from climate change because they think it's boring historically, but I don't know. I think it's exactly the opposite.
If people would like to subscribe to your Heated newsletter, how do they do that?
They go to heated.world, WORLD, because heated.com was $8,000.
Good reason. And I would like to offer the first person who emails me at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com and says that they would like to get a gift subscription to Heated, I will provide that for them. So twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com. Well, I agree with you that it is both super interesting and incredibly important. I've really been enjoying your newsletter. I mean, enjoy is perhaps not always the right word since it makes me angry, but
we try to make the end of the world fun.
The beginning of 2020 has made the end of the world seem so much closer. So, but we will continue to cover this topic, of course, on this podcast, and you will continue to cover it in your newsletter, which is very well written and wonderful, and people should read. And hopefully, we will start to see a difference. I definitely have felt that difference recently, that people are at least paying more attention. And so hopefully that will continue apace in 2020.
Yeah, people think that because I take such a pissed off tone that I'm pessimistic about the future when it comes to climate change. But, I'm not. We talked about that sea change and public opinion. And I think that as long as I've always thought, and I still believe that climate change is a solvable problem, and that we still have a great chance of solving it as long as people stay focused. And I think that they are. Oh, also your listeners should know that if the newsletter is free for once a week, but it's paywalled for the other 3 days. But if they can't afford it, they can just email me and let me know, because, you should be able to know about climate change if you want.
Well, and I will say that, my kids are 8 and 5. And so, we need to make some really big strides at solving this before they are adults. But it is clear that for them, this is just the most important issue. That it doesn't even occur to them that anything else would be more important. That, climate change, of course, is the thing that we have to focus on. And I don't think they're getting that entirely from us. We talk about it, but, I don't think we necessarily say it's the most important issue. But for kids, they get it. They know that this is the future, and we need to be thinking about it. So
we all got the opportunity to think about our futures without scientists telling us that by the year we graduated college, we might see a foot of sea level rise or something like that. These kids are trying to think about what they want to do with their futures and are bombarded by the idea that perhaps the future won't look the way it looks right now. And they have to focus on this instead of focusing on, maybe they want to be a doctor or a musician or something like that. They're like, well, I got to put that on hold until we solve this. And that sucks, that. Yeah, of course, the younger generation prioritizes this because it's their future. And of course, all the people who are saying, we can't do this are old dudes.
Yes. All right. So in with the new and out with the old dudes. Some of them. So, Emily, thank you so much for joining me and talking about this, and for all the work that you are doing. And we will keep an eye on what's happening, and hopefully everyone will continue to realize that climate change is a pressing, important, and very interesting issue.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.